Okay, so good morning. It is Sunday, 8 a.m., and we are going to be talking about, or continue talking about, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, written in 1775, 1776, somewhere in there. It is pleasant to observe by what regular gradations we surmount the force of local prejudice, as we enlarge our acquaintance with the world. A man born in any town in England divided into parishes will naturally associate most with his fellow parishioners, because their interests, in many cases, will be common, and distinguish him by the name of neighbor. If he meet him but a few miles from home, he drops the narrow idea of a street, and salutes him by the name of townsman. If he travels out of the country, he meets him in any other. He forgets the minor divisions of the street and the town, and he calls him countryman. But, if their foreign excursions they should associate in France or in any part of the world, or Europe for that matter, their local re-embrace would be enlarged to that of Englishmen. And, by a just parity of reasoning, all Europeans meeting in America or any other quarter of the globe are countrymen. For England, Holland, Germany, or Sweden, when compared with the whole, stand in the same places on a larger scale, which the divisions of street, town, and country do on smaller ones. Distinctions, too, limited for continental minds. Distinctions too limited for continental minds. Not 1/3 of the inhabitants, even of this province, are of English descent. Wherefore, I reprobate the phrase of parent or country or mother country applied to England only, as being false, selfish, narrow, and ungenerous. So here we have an interesting set of ideas. This graduated approach to understanding connectedness and the union of people in society. So, he begins by saying it is pleasant to observe by what regular gradations we surmount the force of local prejudice. By what regular gradations? So this word means sort of successive stages, levels. And so he says, what levels are there that we can thereby surmount or rise above that force of local prejudice? And prejudice is some unreasoned, I wouldn't necessarily say hate, but it can be, an unreasoned opinion that one can have of another. And so he says this local unreasoned opinion. So how can we surmount this? As we enlarge our acquaintance with the world. And so he goes into these examples. A man born in a town of England is divided into the religious, the churches that he goes to by parishes, and he will naturally associate most with his fellow parishioners. He sees them every day. He communicates with them every day. That relationship at that level is of that nature. It's sort of understanding the nature that he is closer to these people, and therefore he is going to prefer communicating with these people as opposed to other parishes, communicating and interacting. And he says, for an example, he naturally associates with his fellow parishioners because their interests, in many cases, will be common. And he'll distinguish this person by the name of neighbor. And of course we can see here that the name of neighbor implies a closeness. a closeness of living, a closeness of being, a closeness of life. If you meet him but a few miles from home, he drops the narrow idea of a street and salutes him by the name of townsman. So here we see the reason and the dissolving of prejudice, because we can easily say that this new person that he meets that is not of his local parish or on his local street is sort of foreign. But of course, the union that these people find themselves is beyond the local. Okay, now the relationship is obviously different. It's not as I don't want to say confined, but it's not as personal as in the former example. And yet, he abandons the idea of the neighbor of the street, and he says, okay, I have to put this in the proper place. And so to this I will say, and I will salute you as a fellow townsman, because we have this in common. And if he travels out of the country and he meets him in any other, and he forgets the minor divisions of the street and town, he calls him countryman, because that is what binds them together. That's what they have in common. But if in foreign excursions they should associate in France or in any other part of Europe, their local re-embrace would be enlarged into that of Englishmen. And, by just parity of reasoning, all Europeans meeting in America or any other quarter of the globe are countrymen. Now, we can imagine that Europeans might have to travel quite far for that to be the case, but Europe does have a certain binding to it. They share large elements of culture, the Christian tradition. And so he goes on to say, not 1/3 of the inhabitants even of this province are of English descent, wherefore I reprobate the phrase of parent or mother country applied to England only, as being false, selfish, narrow, and ungenerous. That is, there has to be some greater uniting factor here than England, because they're all from different places. So how can you say that England is the mother country when only 1/3 of the people that are in this province are actually from England or are of English descent? He continues to say, but admitting that we were all of English descent, what does it amount to? Nothing. Great Britain, being now an open enemy, extinguishes every other name and title. And to say that reconciliation is our duty is truly farcical. The first king of England, of the present line, William the Conqueror, was a Frenchman, and half the peers of England are descendants from the same country. Wherefore, by the same method of reasoning, England ought to be governed by France. Much has been said about the united strength of Britain and the colonies, that in conjunction they might bid defense to the world. They might bid defiance to the world. But this is mere presumption. The fate of war is uncertain, neither do the expressions mean anything, for this continent would never suffer itself to be trained of inhabitants, to support the British arms in either Asia, Africa, or Europe. So at this moment, I'd like to pause and reflect on what he's saying here. So as a rebuttal, I can imagine one saying that although it is true that there are counter arguments here, I think this is sort of his goal. But to play devil's advocate, there is an obvious relationship to England. That is, we could take many different examples. The language that the people speak, that is English in the American colonies, that is the culture of private property, the rule of law, the degree of individual sovereignty, which is manifest not only in Scripture, but also in the Republican elements of their government within the Republican body, the Commons. They shared this with England. And of course now he's saying, but admitting that we are all of English descent, what does it amount to? Nothing. He says nothing. Britain, being now an open enemy, extinguishes every other name and title. So yes, we can agree with that. Being an enemy, even if you are of English descent, it breaks those bonds. It's no longer the descent is no longer a uniting force. And he goes on to give an example of William the Conqueror being of French descent, and half the peers of England are descendants from the same country. And yet they're still united under the banner of England, which is interesting, because if we use that logic, and we said, okay, if half the descendants of this country are from France, are from French descendants, then it stands to reason that we should be ruled by France. And so there is a fine line here, if we think about it. Because we do have to have this leveled understanding, this graduated approach to prevent from local prejudices. However, we also have to distinguish between a potential enemy, given the circumstance, given the nature of the relationship, but there are limits to this reason. That is, at a certain point, the argument of the descendant no longer holds to bind a people together. Because just as Great Britain can be our mother country, just as French could be the French could be the rulers over England, as the English can be rulers over the American colonists. Much has been said of the united strength of Britain and the colonies. That in conjunction they might bid defiance to the world. But this is mere presumption. He says, the fate of the war is uncertain, neither do the expressions mean anything. For this continent would never suffer itself to be drained of inhabitants to support British arms in either Asia, Africa, or Europe. So, he's drawing this distinction between America's and the colonists' relationship and responsibilities to England. And it's clear that as time goes on, as the conflict increases, as the injuries pile on, the relationship breaks down. And the commitments that America might have at once had to England are now, the bonds that America once had to England are now beginning to fracture and to break. Besides, what have we to do with setting the world at defiance? Our plan is commerce, and that, well attended to, will secure us the peace and the friendship of all Europe, because it is the interest of all Europe to have America a free port. Her trade will always be a protection, and her bareness of gold and silver secured from invaders. I will challenge the warmest advocate for reconciliation to show a single advantage that this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. I repeat the challenge. Not a single advantage is derived. Our corn will fetch its price in any market in Europe, and our imported goods must be paid for. Buy them where we will. But the injuries and disadvantages we sustain by that connection are without number, and our duty to mankind at large, as well as to ourselves, instructs us to renounce the alliance, because any submission to or dependence on Great Britain tends directly to involve this continent in European wars and quarrels, and sets us at variance with nations who would otherwise seek our friendship, and against whom we have neither anger nor complaint. As Europe is our market for trade, we ought to form no partial connection with any part of it. It is the true interest of America to steer clear of European contentions, which she never can do while, by her dependence on Britain, she is made to make weight in the scale of British politics. So, again, this delineation, separated by vast distances, they have reached the point of self-sufficiency. The resources of the land are sufficient for them to provide for themselves. Governance, in terms of English government governance over colonies, has become arbitrary. It's too far, like I've mentioned. Representative government can in no way survive this period and the distance that separates them. And so now it is the American project to thrive, to build their society, and stay out of the conflicts of Europe, because it has no bearing on them. They can trade with them freely. There is no need for this subjection, this prejudice by the perceived mother nation against the colonies. Europe is too thickly planted with the kingdoms to be long at peace, and when even a war breaks out between England and any foreign power, the trade of America goes to ruin because of her connection with Britain. The next war may not turn out like the last, and should it not, the advocates for reconciliation now will be wishing for separation then, because neutrality in that case would be a safer convoy than a man of war. Everything that is right or natural pleads for the separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, "'Tis time to part." Even the distance at which the Almighty has placed England and America is strong and natural proof that the authority of the one over the other was never the design of heaven. There you go. The time, likewise, at which the continent was discovered adds weight to the argument, and the manner in which it was peopled increases the force of it. The Reformation was preceded by the discovery of America, as if the Almighty Gracious meant to open a sanctuary to the persecuted in future years, when home should afford neither friendship nor safety. So, an interesting bit of language here. So to go back to the beginning of that paragraph, he says, Europe is too thickly planted with kingdoms to be long at peace. Their roots grow deep, their relationships are deep with one another, and so therefore their grievances, in some cases, might also be deep between nations, between kingdoms. And he says, when war breaks out between England and any other foreign power, our trade, will be interrupted, because we are inherently connected with England. And he's saying, like in earlier paragraphs, that everything is right or natural. Everything that is right or natural pleads for separation. The blood that has been shed by our men, the weeping voice of nature cries, "It is time to part." Because, of course, as we know from our history, that the colonies fought in war with England. The most recent, I believe, prior to this period, was the French and Indian War, a war between England and France, and Indian nations that chose a side to fight with. And obviously the American colonists had to fight for England. And Mr. Paine here goes into the argument that I was making. He says the distance at which the Almighty has placed England and America is strong and natural proof that the authority of one over the other was never the design of heaven. And then the most interesting thing, I think, is the mention of the Reformation. This sort of revolution in religious thought, sort of the revolution that was necessary to lay the groundwork for the political revolution that we see between the United States or America, the colonies, and Great Britain. And so the people, the revolutionaries, religious revolutionaries that were persecuted, needed some place to go to practice their faith in peace, without the popery. Again, a different type of authoritarian institution. We spent the last episode talking about the negative effects, the negatives associated with the institution of hereditary succession and of the monarchy. It is of the same, of the popery, or of arbitrary authority. Again, this is not to say that institutions are bad. It is within the design and the nature of the institutions that concerns us. And it should not be the abject authority of any particular institution that preserves it. It should be centered around, any institution should be centered around a good that can be pursued. Obviously, there are misplaced goods, but it is, in every case, in every institution, whether it's corporate, religious, or political, if the good that it revolves around becomes pathological, one of the telling symptoms of this will be arbitrary control, would be subjection to an arbitrary authority in which the people have no say. And I should mention, what goes along with the people have no say is that the people must have some sort of representation, or they must consent to it. As in the case of a corporation, obviously you can choose whether or not to work there. If you are employed against your will, this is obviously a corrupt institution. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if you work for a corporation, that just because you make that decision, then it absolves you of the responsibility of listening to those who are in positions of authority. Now, the conversation about the nature of man's relationship to corporate bodies is an interesting one, but that's not the topic of today. He continues, "The authority of Great Britain over this continent is a form of government which sooner or later must have an end. And a serious mind can draw no true pleasure by looking forward under the painful and positive conviction that what he calls the present Constitution is merely temporary, As parents, we can have no joy knowing that this government is not sufficiently lasting to ensure anything which we may bequeath to posterity. And by a plain method of argument, we are running the next generation into debt. How similar is that to today? We ought to do the work of it. Otherwise, we use them meanly and pitifully. In order to discover the line of our duty rightly, we should take our children in our hand and fix our station for a few years further into life. That eminence will present a prospect which a few present fears and prejudices conceal from our sight. So interesting information here. He's saying that eventually the authority of Great Britain and its government in its current form will come to an end. The present Constitution is temporary. He's saying as parents, we sort of have to look back, take a step back, broaden our horizons, and understand what we might be giving to the subsequent generations. And he's saying, as we are running the next generation into debt, whether it be monetarily or whether it be the debt of liberty, because there's more than one thing that you can owe. Perhaps it boils down to the same thing, but in the monetary sense, you owe something of value, which you might equate to time, labor, effort, that you might otherwise devote to other things. Another kind of debt, of course, could be the debt of a certain type of conscious mind, or the absence of it, the paying of attention, our labors that are going towards a nation that doesn't represent us or our interests. Excessive taxation, again, this is a type of debt. Assuming that it is unrepresented, not consented to, arbitrary. Though I would carefully avoid giving unnecessary offense, yet I am inclined to believe that all those who espouse the doctrine of reconciliation may be included within the following descriptions: interested men who are not to be trusted, weak men who cannot see, prejudiced men who will not see, and a certain set of moderate men who think better of the European world than it deserves. And this last class, by an ill-judged deliberation, will be the cause of more calamities to this continent than all the other three. So again, those who espouse the doctrine of reconciliation, or returning to a state of union with Great Britain, may be included within the following descriptions. So interested people, interested men, who are not to be trusted, deceitful. Weak men who cannot see, so ignorance. Prejudiced men who are the types of traditionalists that abandon their reason and place an anchor firmly into the earth. They will not appeal, and reason will not appeal to them whatsoever. And the last class, an ill-judged deliberation. He says, this will be the cause of more calamities to this continent than all the other three. So an unwise approach. It is the good fortune of many to live distant from the scene of sorrow. The evil is not sufficiently brought to their doors to make them feel precariousness with which all American property is possessed. But let our imaginations transport us for a few moments to Boston. The seat of wretchedness will teach us wisdom, and instruct us to renounce the power in whom we can have no trust. The inhabitants of that unfortunate city, who but a few months ago were in ease and affluence, have now no other alternative than to stay and starve, or to turn out and beg, endangered by the fire of their friends if they continue within the city, and plundered by the soldiery if they leave it. In their present situation, they are prisoners without the hope of redemption, and in a general attack for their relief, they would be exposed to the fury of both armies. So interesting, you see here in Boston a situation of the sort of martial law in which the army is having them stay at in their homes in an attempt to restore some form of order that they consider to be just. And you also have their neighbors, the fellow townsmen, who are loyal to the crown and to England. When I was reading that, I was thinking about what's happening in China right now. And so as I sit here, it is November 27th of 2022. And this is in the wake of the COVID pandemic. Of course, much of it now in the United States has died down. The restrictions have died down. We still deal with the consequences and the fallout, both psychologically and economically. But my thoughts turn towards China. And in that country, the restrictions have not lessened. They have what is called a no-COVID policy. And being an authoritarian regime, a communist country, their individuals have no liberties. Some people there have been locked into their houses, literally locked into their houses. I saw a video of a burning building in which people could not exit their apartment or exit the building because they were locked in by the authorities, and they were suffered to burn to death. I've seen many videos of protests by the citizens, an astonishing type of protesting. I heard a man saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," an American saying from the time of the revolution. And this type of thing in a communist country, in a country such as China, is unheard of. And there has been much talk of their experience with and the potential for liberation. Liberation of their people, liberation from the yoke of the Chinese Communist Party. And many have thought that it wouldn't happen. It still remains to be seen whether it will happen or not. But certainly as their affluence grows and the information from the internet flows in, despite how restrictive the government might be in terms of certain websites and information, they will begin to see, as we will begin to see, the true nature of our world and of the institutions that govern it. And it is my hope that in my lifetime that liberty and truth wins out. Of course, we have to have faith in truth, that it will win out. But I just figured I'd mention that because it's an interesting thing that's happening, an interesting bit of current events. And it's not just a local protesting. This is happening all over the country. It's happening in China. There are protests that are happening in Iran. And so it'll be interesting to see here how this plays out in the future. Because as we sit on one hand with a group of people, perhaps an axis of powers, that prefer to govern in one way, and we have another axis of powers that is of a particular tradition that does seem to be in a bit of decay. It's not as strong as it once was, not as strong as it was at the founding of its country, certainly. And conflict is starting to arise. People are desirous for the truth, and they want some form of independence that is most optimal. And it is because of this circumstance and this situation that makes this particular time to be alive very interesting. And I fear that it is going to be a bit of a rocky road in the next 10 years here. But if history shows us anything, things tend to have to get bad before they get worse, or before they get better, rather, I should say. They probably will get worse as they get bad, but ideally they will get better in time. So as you might be able to hear, it's raining outside right now. We're going to continue here with Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Men of passive tempers look somewhat lightly over the offences of Britain, and still hoping for the best, are apt to call out, "Come, come, we shall be friends," again, for all this. But examine the passions and the feelings of mankind. Bring the doctrine of reconciliation to the touchstone of nature, and tell me whether you can have hereafter love, honor, and faithfully serve the power that has carried the fire and the sword into your land. So let me reread that section, because he poses it as a question rather than a declaration. But examine the passions and feelings of mankind. Bring the doctrine of reconciliation to the touchstone of nature, and then tell me whether you can hereafter love, honor, and faithfully serve the power that has carried fire and sword into your land. If you cannot do all these, then you are only deceiving yourselves, and by your delay bringing ruin upon your posterity. Your future connection with Britain, whom you can neither love nor honor, will be forced and unnatural, and being formed only on the plan of present convenience, will in a little time fail into a relapse more wretched than the first. But if you say you can still pass the violations over, then I ask, has your house been burned? Has your property been destroyed before your face? Are your wife and children destitute of a bed to lie on, or bread to live on? Have you lost a parent or a child by their hands? And has yourself the ruined and wretched survivor? If not, then you are not a judge of those who have. But if you have, and can still shake hands with the murderers, then you are unworthy of the name of husband, father, friend, or lover, and whatever may be your rank or title in life. You have the heart of a coward, and the spirit of a sycophant. So fairly straightforward here. He's saying that the weak among us will continue to look somewhat lightly over the offenses of Great Britain. And he lists out quite extensive offenses here. Has your house been burned? Has your property been destroyed before your face? Are your wife and your children destitute of a bed to lie on, or bread to live on? Have you lost a parent or a child by their hands, and yourself the ruined and wretched survivor? If you have, and can still shake the hands with the murderers, then you are unworthy of the name of husband, father, friend, or lover, and whatever may be your rank or title in life, you have the heart of a coward and the spirit of a sycophant. So tough words there, but also a very difficult situation to find yourself in. I can only imagine what that must have been like. How frustrating it must have been, how maddening it must have been for those things to take place for those people. And it's no wonder the rhetoric that we have been reading thus far is the way it is. It's because of the behavior of the soldiery, of the ministers, of the judges that are beholden to the king. And it's no wonder why the American colonists want to be separated from the body of England. This is not inflaming or exaggerating matters, but trying them by those feelings and affections which nature justifies, and without which we should be incapable of discharging the social duties of life, or enjoying the felicities of it. I mean not to exhibit the horror for the purpose of provoking revenge, but to awaken us from fatal and unmanly slumbers, that we may pursue determinately some fixed object. It is not in the power of Britain or of Europe to conquer America, if she does not conquer herself by delay and timidity. The present winter isn't worth an age if rightly employed, but if lost or neglected, the whole continent will partake of the misfortune. And there is no punishment which that man will not deserve, be he who, or what, or where he will, that may be the remains of sacrificing a season so precious and useful. So he's saying, I'm not saying these things to provoke revenge or unjust violence, perhaps, but we have to be aware of these things. He says, this is not inflaming or exaggerating matters, but trying them by those very feelings and affections which nature justifies, and without which we should be incapable of discharging the social duties of life, or enjoying the felicities of it. So it is within the very feeling of objection to the unjust, what would you say, manner in which England has conducted themselves against the American colonists, that it is within this very nature of feeling, this way of being, this way of responding to, that makes it capable of discharging the social duties of life and enjoying the felicities of it. So, beautiful language there. And he says, I mean not to exhibit the horror for purpose of provoking revenge, but to wake people up, to make them understand, to bring them out of that cave from fatal and unmanly slumbers. I like that. That we may pursue determinately some fixed object. And he says it's not in the power of Britain or of Europe to conquer America, if she does not conquer herself by delay and timidity. So this last little passage here I find interesting. He says, the present winter isn't worth the age of rightly employed. The present winter isn't worth an age if rightly employed, but if lost or neglected, the whole continent will partake of the misfortune. So if we were to look at this symbolically, so the present winter, so the darkness, the coldness, the present winter isn't worth an age if rightly employed, but if lost or neglected, the whole continent will partake of the misfortune. And there is no punishment which that man will not deserve, be he who, or what, or where he will, that may be the means of sacrificing a season so precious and useful. So if we utilize our time here properly, it will not be wasted. But if we do waste this time, and waste this opportunity, and waste the time in which we find ourselves, the present circumstances have opened up the door to a strong realization of the true nature and the soul of liberty. If we fail to capitalize on it, then there will be no punishment which man will not deserve. So he continues, "It is repugnant to reason, to the universal order of things, to all examples of former ages, to suppose that this continent can no longer be subject to any external power. The most sanguine in Britain does not think so. The utmost stretch of human wisdom cannot, at this time, compass a plan short of separation, which can promise the continent even a year's security. Reconciliation is now a fallacious dream. Nature has deserted the connection, and art cannot supply her place. For, as Milton wisely expresses, never can true reconcilement grow where wounds of deadly hate have pierced so deep." In other words, the threshold has been reached. I do like that quote by Milton at the end there. Never can true reconcilement grow where wounds of deadly hate have pierced so deep. So, the wounds of hate have pierced so deep that has broken all bonds of fellow countrymen, of religion, of family, perhaps, in certain circumstances. Interesting. Every quiet method for peace has been ineffectual. Our prayers have been rejected with disdain, and only tended to convince us that nothing flatters vanity or confirms obstinacy in kings more than repeated petitioning, and nothing has contributed more than this very measure to make the kings of Europe absolute. Witness Denmark and Sweden. Wherefore, since nothing but blows will do, for God's sake, let us come to a final separation, and not leave the next generation to be cutting throats under the violated unmeaning names of parent and child. To say they will never attempt it again is idle and visionary. We thought so at the repeal of the Stamp Act, yet a year or two undeceived us. As well may we suppose that nations which have been once defeated will never renew the quarrel. In other words, we have to do it now. Otherwise, we risk more than even the present injuries that have been done to us. As to government matters, it is not in the power of Britain to do this continent justice. The business of it will be soon too weighty and intricate to be managed with any tolerable degree of conviction by a power so distant from us, and so very ignorant of us. For if they cannot conquer us, they cannot govern us. To be always running 3,000 or 4,000 miles with a tale or a petition, waiting 4 or 5 months for an answer, which when obtained requires 5 or 6 more to explain it, will in a few years be looked upon as folly and childish. There was a time when it was proper, and there is a proper time for it to cease. Small islands, not capable of protecting themselves, are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care. But there is something very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. In no instance has nature made the satellite larger than its primary planet. And as England and America with respect to each other, reverses the common order of nature, it is evident that they belong to two different systems: England to Europe, America to itself. I am not induced by motives of pride, party, or resentment to espouse the doctrine of separation and independence. I am clearly, positively, and consciously persuaded that it is the true interest of this continent to be so, that everything short of that is mere patchwork, that it can afford no lasting felicity, that it is leaving the sword to our children and shrinking back at a time when a little more, a little farther, would have rendered this continent the glory of the earth. As Britain has not manifested the least inclination towards a compromise, we may be assured that no terms can be obtained worthy the acceptance of the continent, or any ways equal to the expense of blood and treasure we have been already put to. So, again, familiar language, as we've heard in previous paragraphs. It's grievance after grievance. Now is the perfect time. We have to take advantage, otherwise we leave all of this to our posterity, all of this and worse to our posterity, as the yoke of subjection does not relieve itself in the face of weakness or in the sight of blindness. The object contended for ought always to bear some just proportion to the expense. The removal of North, or the whole detestable junto, is a matter unworthy to the millions that we have expended. A temporary stoppage of trade was an inconvenience which would have sufficiently balanced the repeal of all the acts complained of, had such repeals been obtained. But if the whole continent must take up arms, if every man must be a soldier, it is scarcely worth our while to fight against a contemptible ministry only. Dearly, dearly do we pay for the repeal of the acts, if that is all we fight for. For, in a just estimation, it is as great a folly to pay for a Bunker Hill price for law as for land. As I have always considered the independency of this continent as an event which sooner or later must arrive, so from the late rapid progress of the continent to maturity, the event could not be far off. Wherefore, on the breaking out of hostilities, it was not worth the while to have disputed a matter which time would have fairly redressed, unless we meant to be in earnest. Otherwise, it is like wasting an estate on a suit at law, to regulate the trespasses of a tenant whose lease is just expiring. No man was a warmer wisher for reconciliation than myself before the fatal 19th of April, 1775. But the moment the event of that day was made known, I rejected the hardened, sullen-tempered Pharaoh of England forever, disdain the wretched, that with the pretended title of father of his people can unfeelingly hear of their slaughter, and composedly sleep with their blood upon his soul. Okay, so to go over this paragraph here, he starts by saying, the object contended for, so what we fight for, ought always to bear some just proportion to the expense, or what is paid for that contention, or what it is that we are contending with. The removal of North, or the whole detestable junto, so this sort of corrupt body, is a matter unworthy of the millions that we have expended. A temporary stoppage of trade was an inconvenience which would have sufficiently balanced the repeal of all the acts complained of. So, a temporary stoppage of trade. This would have sufficiently balanced the repeal of the acts complained of. And of course there were many different acts that were imposed, the Stamp Act being one of them, putting unjust taxes on various paper goods. So he's saying a temporary stoppage of trade was an inconvenience which would have sufficiently balanced the repeal of all the acts complained of, had such repeals been obtained. But if the whole continent must take up arms, if every man must be a soldier, it's not worth our while to fight against the contemptible ministry only. It has to be expanded. It has to be the entirety. It says we pay for the repeal of the act, if that is all we fight for. Right? So, in other words, the acts that are imposed on the colonies by England, by Great Britain, we could have done this, that, and the other. We would pay for these acts, but the object of their contention would not be worth the expense in that case. But in the case of fighting for their liberty, fighting against England in a war for their independence, for their liberty, the contention is worth the expense. It is as great a folly to pay for a Bunker Hill price for law as for land. So an interesting statement here, I'll read it again. In a just estimation, it is as great a folly to pay a Bunker Hill price for law as it is for land. So, in other words, they're equal. And Bunker Hill obviously was the Siege of Boston, sort of the first event of, considered one of the first events of the Revolutionary War. And so we pay that price for law. Might as well pay that price for land. As I have always considered the independency of this continent as an event which sooner or later must arrive, so from the late rapid progress of the continent to maturity, the event could not be far off. Wherefore, on the breaking out of hostilities, it is not worth the while to have disputed a matter which time would only have fairly redressed, unless we meant to be in earnest. Otherwise, it is like wasting an estate on a suit at law to regulate the trespasses of a tenant whose lease is just expiring. In some sense, it was inevitable for this to happen. Mr. Paine says he has always considered the continent to be independent. Sooner or later, it'll arrive. And he felt that in the breaking out of hostilities, it wasn't necessarily worth while to have a disputed matter, which would have resolved themselves. The much larger conflict inevitably to come should not be wasted on such trifling matters. But the big events eventually came, and in April, the 19th of April, 1775, these were the events of Lexington and Concord, I believe this is where this is the shot that was heard around the world. First battle between the American colonies in England. And he said from that moment, he rejected the hardened, sullen-tempered Pharaoh of England forever. And he disdained the wretch, and he despised the title, Father of his people. And we've already discussed the language between the familial and the subject. That is to say, that a father does not prevent the flourishing of his children. And he says that this Pharaoh of England, this father of people, can unfeelingly hear of their slaughter, and composedly sleep with their blood upon his soul. Strong words. But admitting that matters were now made up, what would be the event? I answer, the ruin of the continent, and that for several reasons. First, the powers of governing still remain in the hands of the king. He will have a negative over the whole legislation of the continent. And as he has shown himself such an inveterate enemy to liberty, and discovered such a thirst for arbitrary power, is he, or is he not, a proper person to say to these colonies, you shall make no laws but what I please? And is there any inhabitant in America so ignorant as not to know that I, according to what is called the present Constitution, this continent can make no laws but what the king gives leave to? And is there any man so unwise as not to see that, considering what has happened, he will suffer no law to be made here, but such as suits his purposes? We may be as effectually enslaved by the want of laws in America, as by submitting to laws made for us in England. After matters are made up, as it is called, can there be any doubt but the whole power of the crown will be exerted to keep this continent as low and as humble as possible? Instead of going forward, we shall go backward, or be perpetually quarreling, or ridiculously petitioning. We are already greater than the king wishes us to be, and will he not hereafter endeavor to make us less? To bring the matter to one point, is the power who is jealous of our prosperity a proper power to govern us? Whoever says no to this question is an independent, for independency means no more than this: whether we shall make our own laws, or whether the king, the greatest enemy which this continent has or can have, shall tell us there shall be no laws but such as I like. So, to put this in my dumb language, a little hypothetical here. What if all matters were made up? What would be the event that would take place? Well, Mr. Paine feels that it would be the ruin of the continent. He says, the powers of governing still remain in the hands of the king, and he'll have a negative impact over the power of legislation. And negative law is a law that's explicitly prohibitive. It says, you may not do this. You may not go there and do this. And the king says, you shall make no laws but what I please. Again, top-down, authoritarian, arbitrary, negative. And he says, "And is there any inhabitant in America so ignorant as not to know that I, according to what is called the present Constitution, this continent can make no laws but the King gives leave to?" So hopefully the answer to that question is no, because if everybody realizes that nobody has any control over their own governance, or that the king, according to the present Constitution, is the only one that can make laws over the land, they should get on board this revolutionary vessel. And is there any man so unwise as not to see that, considering what has happened, he will suffer no law to be made here, but such as suits his purpose? That is, the king's purpose. And he says, "We may be as effectually enslaved by the want of laws in America as by submitting to laws as made for us in England." So there's a choice between effectively being enslaved by the want of laws, or by being enslaved by the laws, by the legislature and the king in England. And of course, if you are effectively enslaved by the want of laws, at least you have an opportunity to fight for it, so that you may someday, your posterity may someday, design laws for themselves over their own people, locally. After matters are made up, as it is called, can there be any doubt but the whole power of the crown will be exerted to keep this continent low and humble as possible? And the answer is no. Obviously, they're going to come down with an iron fist if this whole conflict does not go in the favor of the American colonies. Instead of going forward, we shall go backward, or be perpetually quarreling, or ridiculously petitioning. And they would be ridiculously quarreling with England. They'd be ridiculously quarreling with the ministers in the colonies and the judges appointed by the crown that reside in the colonies. And they'd be ridiculously petitioning. And it would be ridiculous because the petitions would have no weight. They would produce no change. We are already greater than the king wishes us to be, and he will not hereafter endeavor us to make us less. Of course, through jealousy he will. To bring the matter to one point, is a power who is jealous of our prosperity a proper power to govern us? Absolutely not, because that jealousy, it'll lead to negative law, it'll lead to oppression, it'll lead to violence. Whoever says no to this question is an independent. Because if you say no, then you recognize that a jealous governor across the Atlantic Ocean will not have the same effect as people representing the local population in their local government, understanding the particularities of each circumstance and the unique intricacies that go on with everyday life. And of course, a local legislature, one taken from the body of the people, presumably would not be this jealous authoritarian overlord. And if it was the case, if this expressed itself in the body of the local governance, they could be expelled from office. There's no hereditary succession there. They're not placed there by birth. There's no bloodline. People don't have to vote for them next time. king, you will say, has a negative in England. The people there can make no laws without his consent. In point of right and good order, there is something very ridiculous, that a youth of 21, which has often happened, shall say to several millions of people, older and wiser than himself, I forbid this or that act of yours to be law. And it seems as though he might be referencing a soldier or a policeman, a young man enforcing the law. Or perhaps even a young legislature, a young legislator, somebody of the nobility, a peer of the king. But in this place I decline this sort of reply, though I will never cease to expose the absurdity of it, and only answer that England being the king's residence and not America, and America not, makes quite another case. The king's negative here is 10 times more dangerous and fatal than it can be in England, for there he will scarcely refuse his consent to a bill for putting England into as strong a state of defense as possible, and in America he would never suffer such a bill to be passed. So even in the condition of what Thomas Paine and many others considered to be a pathological institution, that of the monarchy, or of the hereditary institution of hereditary succession, it's still worse in America due to this separation in levels. America is just a colony. It is not truly part of the English body. They're not truly Englishmen. Again, it's this separation by degrees, by distance. America is only a secondary object in the system of British politics. England consults the good of this country no further than it answers her own purpose. Wherefore, her own interest leads her to suppress the growth of ours in every case, which does not promote her advantage, or in the least interferes with it. A pretty state we should soon be in under such a second-hand government, considering what has happened. Men do not change from enemies to friends by the alteration of a name, and in order to show that reconciliation now is a dangerous doctrine, I affirm that it would be policy in the king at this time to repeal the acts for the sake of reinstating himself in the government of the provinces, in order that he may accomplish by craft and subtlety in the long run what he cannot do by force and violence in the short one. Reconciliation and ruin are nearly related. So this is to say that in light of the recent events, in light of the Boston Massacre, in light of the siege at Boston, in light of the excessive taxation and the oppression of the ministers on behalf of the English crown, the events of the 19th of April of 1775, if we were to pursue reconciliation now, and the king would repeal the acts for the sake of getting himself into the good graces of the colonists, over time, through craft and subtlety, he would again subvert and subject the English colonies to his authoritarian rule. Secondly, he says that as even the best terms which we can expect to obtain can amount to no more than a temporary expedient, or a kind of government by guardianship, which can last no longer than till the colonies come of age. So the general face and the state of things, in the interim, will be unsettled and unpromising. Immigrants of property will not choose to come to a country whose form of government hangs but by a thread, and which is every day tottering on the brink of commotion and disturbance. And numbers of the present inhabitants would lay hold of the interval to dispose of their effects and quit the continent. So again, even if at the resolution of conflict there is some restoration of the union between the colonies and England, it would amount to no more than a temporary expedient. And this will last only until the colonies regather themselves and come of age. And when they come of age, they will want to leave the household. They will want to leave their parents' nest. And again, at that time, the conflicts will emerge again. In the meantime, the people that come to the country from elsewhere will see this. They will see the uncertainty. They will see the distable government. And they won't want to settle there. They won't feel that their religious liberty will be protected there. They don't feel that their liberty in general would be protected in the colonies. So that they won't come. They will quit the continent. But the most powerful of all arguments is that nothing but independence, i.e., a continental form of government, can keep the peace of the continent and preserve it inviolate from civil wars. I dread the event of a reconciliation with Britain now, as it is more than probable that it will be followed by a revolt somewhere or other, the consequences of which may be far more fatal than all the malice of Britain. So again, saying the same thing. Saying reconciliation now. We may have momentary peace, but this will come back around again because nothing has been fixed. Thousands are already ruined by British barbarity. Thousands more will probably suffer the same fate. Those men have other feelings than us who have nothing suffered. All they now possess is liberty. What they before enjoyed is a sacrifice to its service, and having nothing more to lose, they disdain submission. Besides, the general tempers of the colonies towards a British government will be like that of a youth who is nearly out of his time. They will care very little about her, and a government which cannot preserve the peace is no government at all. And in that case we pay our money for nothing, and pray, what is it that Britain can do, whose power will be wholly on paper, should a civil tumult break out the very day after the reconciliation? I have heard some men say, many of whom, I believe, spoke without thinking, that they dreaded an independence, fearing that it would produce civil wars. It is but seldom that our first thoughts are truly correct, and that it is the case here. For there is 10 times more to dread from a patched-up connection than from independence. I make the sufferer's case my own, and I protest that were I driven from my house and home, my property destroyed, and my circumstances ruined, that as a man, sensible of injuries, I could never relish the doctrine of reconciliation, or consider myself bound thereby. So, he continues the same line of thinking here about reconciliation and how it won't work because of, in part, of the events that have already happened, but he also outlines here the sort of the counter-argument that some propose, that it's possible for civil conflicts to break out, those that support the union with Great Britain, those that do not, those that maybe that don't want to join the union, and those that do. The colonies have manifested such a spirit of good order and obedience to continental government, as is sufficient to make every reasonable person easy and happy on that head. No man can assign the least pretense for his fears on any other grounds than such as are truly childish and ridiculous. That one colony will be striving for superiority over another. So there you go. The civil conflict of superiority is what some people are afraid of. But as the behavior of the time lays it out to be, as Mr. Paine demonstrates here with his language, the colonies have manifested such a spirit of good order and obedience to continental government, that is, the wish, the desire towards unity, as is sufficient to make every reasonable person easy and happy on that head. That is, there is no risk of civil conflict or of one colony trying to dominate another. Where there are no distinctions, there can be no superiority. Perfect equality affords no temptation. The republics of Europe are all, and we may say always, in peace. Holland and Switzerland are without wars, foreign or domestic. Monarchical governments, it is true, are never long at rest. The crown itself is a temptation to enterprising ruffians at home, and that degree of pride and insolence ever attendant on legal authority swells into a rupture with foreign powers, in instances where a republican government, by being formed by more natural principles, would negotiate the mistake. So, a republican government, more predisposed to reason and debate, whereas a more authoritarian monarchical government, more quick to the passions. If there is any true cause for fear respecting independence, it is because no plan is yet laid down. Men do not see their way out. Wherefore, as an opening into that business, I offer the following hints, at the same time modesty affirming that I have no other opinion of them myself than that they may be the means of giving rise to something better. Could the straggling thought of individuals be collected, they would frequently form materials for wise and able men to improve into a useful matter. I can imagine this playing out in the minds of those that left England in the early days to colonize North America. I'm sure many of them left because they had a plan in mind. They had an idea that they could establish their own life free from persecution, religious or otherwise. And it's in that very plan, that very idea, that dispelled their fears. Now, of course, I'm sure fears still crept in, but I'm imagining that this plan and this idea of liberty and the pursuit of it was enough to carry them from England all the way to North America on a much more treacherous route, a much less navigated route, mind you, than in this day, than in the late 18th century. It's an interesting sentence. Could the straggling thoughts of individuals be collected, they would frequently form materials for wise and able men to improve into useful matter. Isn't that true for all of us? Many of us have these independent, straggling thoughts in our minds that are often disconnected from a plan or from some decisive action, and they sort of are left there to rot. But in the head of a wise man, if he were to collect these, he'd be able to use them to improve into useful matter, which is the key here. And this is one of the, when we think about the burdens of liberty, this is certainly one of the, as Mr. Payne suggests here, he's offering the hint. This is what you do with your thoughts. This is what you do with your insecurities. You put them together, you unify them, you make a plan, and you execute. Don't worry too much about it, just do it.